What if I told you that the biggest bank you have never heard of just printed $650 billion out of thin air in August 2021? And nobody talked about it. Not on the news. Not in Congress. Nobody. The International Monetary Fund, the so-called firefighter of global finance, just created the largest single issuance of currency in human history. And you didn't get a check. Your government did. And now, you're paying it back with inflation you can feel every single time you buy groceries, fill up your tank, or try to afford rent. Here's the thing, the IMF doesn't work for you. It never did. It works for the system that keeps countries trapped in permanent debt. And in 2025, that trap is about to snap shut on a scale we've never seen. This isn't about Greece. It's not about Argentina. It's about the entire architecture of global money. And the files that just leaked prove they've known this was coming for decades. So let me ask you this. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments, because I guarantee you, your government is already in the system I'm about to expose. And if you want the unfiltered truth about how global finance really works, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to show you doesn't get taught in economics classes. It gets buried in IMF board meeting minutes. Let's go. The International Monetary Fund was born in 1944 at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. World War II wasn't even over yet. The official story goes like this. The world needed a safety net, a lender of last resort to prevent countries from collapsing into chaos like they did in the 1930s. Noble, right? Stability, cooperation, peace. But here's what they don't tell you. The IMF was designed from day one to be a control mechanism. It wasn't about helping countries. It was about locking them into a financial architecture dominated by the United States and its allies. The voting structure proved it. The United States got veto power. Europe got permanent seats. Everyone else got crumbs and conditions. And those conditions? That's where the game really starts. See, when a country goes to the IMF for a loan, they don't just get money. They get a list. Cut public spending, privatize state assets, open your markets to foreign capital, devalue your currency. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what happened to Greece in 2010. That's exactly what happened to Argentina 5 separate times. That is exactly what happened to Sri Lanka in 2022, when their government literally collapsed and the president fled the country. The IMF calls it structural adjustment. Economists call it conditionality. I call it financial colonialism. Here's how it works. A country hits a crisis. Could be a pandemic. Could be a commodity shock. Could be corruption, sure. But often it's just bad luck in a rigged global system. They run out of foreign currency reserves. They can't pay their debts. They go to the IMF. And the IMF says, sure, we'll lend you money. But first, you have to destroy your social safety net, fire your teachers, sell your utilities to foreign corporations. And oh, by the way, you'll be paying us back in dollars or euros, not your own currency. So good luck when we devalue your money as part of the deal. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly the playbook they used in Latin America in the 1980s. They called it the lost decade. An entire generation sacrificed to debt repayment. Suicide rates spiked, poverty exploded, and the IMF published papers about how successful their programs were. But here's the part that should terrify you. The mechanism they used back then was primitive compared to what they're doing now. Back then, it was bilateral loans and currency pegs. Now, it's something far more sophisticated, something most people have never even heard of. Special drawing rights, SDRs. This is where it gets wild. An SDR is not a real currency. You can't hold it. You can't spend it. It's a synthetic basket of 5 major currencies, weighted by economic power: the dollar, the euro, the yuan, the yen, the pound. The IMF creates SDRs by unanimous vote, and then allocates them to member countries based on their quota, which is just a fancy word for how much power they have in the system. In August 2021, the IMF issued $650 billion worth of SDRs, the largest issuance in history. They called it pandemic relief. They said it would help poor countries recover from COVID. Sound familiar? Because that's exactly what they said in 2009 after the financial crisis, and in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis, and in 1982 during the Latin American debt crisis. But here's the catch. The allocation wasn't equal. Rich countries, the ones that didn't need help, got 60% of the SDRs. The United States got 113 billion. China got 42 billion. Poor countries, the ones actually drowning in debt, got pocket change. And they can only use their SDRs by trading them for real currency with rich countries, which means they are now even more dependent on the same nations that dominate the IMF in the first place. It's a debt trap wrapped in a technocratic press release, and the files that just leaked from internal IMF board meetings show they knew this. They knew the SDR allocation wouldn't help the countries that needed it most. They knew it would entrench dollar dominance. They knew it would increase long-term dependency. They did it anyway. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the IMF is corrupt. We already knew that, but here's the twist. The SDR system isn't just about loans. It's about replacing the dollar as the world's reserve currency, but in a way that gives even more power to a smaller group of technocrats. There's a man who's been at the center of this for decades. A French economist who ran the IMF during the 2008 financial crisis. A man who was literally convicted of corruption in France, but somehow kept his job at the global financial table. His name is Dominique Strauss-Kahn, and in 2011, he gave a speech at the Brookings Institution where he said, and I quote, "The SDR could be the embryo of a global currency." Think about that. A currency that no citizen votes on, that no country controls, that gets allocated by a board of unelected bureaucrats based on quotas designed in 1944. Strauss-Kahn was pushing for this right up until he was arrested in New York on charges that were later dropped. But by then, he was out. Convenient timing, right? But the plan didn't die. It went underground. And now, with inflation spiking, with the dollar weaponized through sanctions, with countries like China and Russia openly trying to bypass the dollar system, the IMF is dusting off the SDR playbook. And here's the kicker. In April 2023, the IMF published a working paper titled "The Stealth Erosion of Dollar Dominance." Not a conspiracy blog, an official IMF paper. It outlined exactly how the SDR could become the backbone of a new monetary order by 2035. You won't believe the name they used to describe it. They called it the multipolar reserve system, and the receipt is wilder than you think. Let me break down exactly how the system works, because once you see the mechanics, you can't unsee the trap. Step 1. A country enters a crisis. Let's say it's a developing nation in Africa. Commodity prices crash. Their currency plummets. They can't afford to import food or fuel. Protests start. The government panics. Step 2. They go to the IMF. The IMF offers a loan, but not in the country's own currency. The loan is denominated in SDRs, which are convertible to dollars, euros, or yuan. This is critical. The debt is not in a currency the country controls. It's in a currency basket controlled by the 5 most powerful economies on Earth. Step 3. The IMF attaches conditions. Cut subsidies. Raise interest rates. Privatize state industries. Fire government workers. The country has no choice. They sign. The money flows in. Step 4. The country tries to repay the debt. But here's the problem. Their economy is now smaller because they just gutted public spending. Their currency is weaker because the IMF forced devaluation. And the debt is still denominated in foreign currency, which is now more expensive to buy, so they can't pay it back. They go back to the IMF for another loan. The cycle repeats. By step 5, the country is trapped. 40% of their government budget goes to debt service. Schools close, hospitals run out of medicine, infrastructure crumbles, but the debt keeps growing, and the IMF keeps lending, because the goal was never repayment. The goal was dependency. Now, let's talk numbers. Because this isn't theory, this is happening right now. As of 2024, 73 countries were spending more on debt service than on healthcare. 73. That's not a recession. That's structural violence. Sri Lanka's external debt hit $51 billion in 2022. They defaulted. The IMF stepped in with the $2.9 billion loan, but the conditions included cutting government jobs and raising taxes on the poorest citizens. 6 months later, the government fell. Pakistan has gone to the IMF 23 times since 1958. 23. They're not a failed state. They're a client state. Their entire economic policy is written in Washington and approved in IMF board meetings. Zambia defaulted on $13 billion of debt in 2020. The IMF offered $1.3 billion in relief, but the conditions required selling off the state mining company, which controls the country's copper, the only resource keeping their economy alive. Foreign corporations bought it at a fraction of its value. Egypt's IMF loan package hit $8 billion in 2023. The conditions required them to devalue their currency by 50%. Overnight, the cost of living doubled. Bread riots followed. The government deployed the military, and the IMF released a statement praising Egypt's commitment to reform. Here's another number that should chill you. The total global debt held by low and middle income countries hit $9 trillion in 2023. $9 trillion. And 70% of that debt is owed to private creditors and multilateral institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. These aren't loans between governments anymore. This is a globalized debt market where countries are commodities. Now, here's where the SDR system gets truly insidious. When the IMF issues SDRs, they don't just hand them out. They record them as assets on each country's balance sheet. But SDRs aren't real money. You can't spend them directly. You have to trade them with another country for real currency. And the only countries that will trade with you are the ones with excess reserves, which means the rich countries. So poor countries end up trading their SDRs for dollars at unfavorable rates, which means they're getting even less value than the official allocation suggests. It's a shell game. The IMF prints $650 billion in SDRs, claims they're helping the world, but the actual liquidity that reaches developing countries is a fraction of that. The rest gets absorbed by the same financial institutions that caused the crisis in the first place. And here's the moral hazard at the center of it all. The IMF is funded by its member countries. The biggest contributors, the United States, Europe, and China, are also the biggest beneficiaries of the current system. They have no incentive to change it. In fact, they profit from keeping it exactly as broken as it is. Because every time a country defaults, their assets get sold off. Every time a currency collapses, foreign capital swoops in and buys everything at fire sale prices. Every time the IMF issues a new loan, it entrenches the dominance of the dollar, the euro, and the yuan. The system is designed to concentrate wealth and power at the top, and to keep everyone else in a permanent state of managed crisis. And now, in 2025, the cracks are showing. The debt is unsustainable. The inflation is global. The political instability is spreading. And the IMF's own economists are publishing papers admitting that the next crisis will be worse than 2008, worse than the 1930s. Because this time, the debt is everywhere. Governments, corporations, households. There is no clean balance sheet left to bail anyone out. This is the illusion of stability. We've been living on borrowed time, borrowed money, and borrowed credibility. And the people who built this system, the people in those leaked IMF files, they knew the math didn't work. They knew it would collapse. They just needed it to last long enough to consolidate power into a new system. A system where the SDR becomes the default global reserve, and the IMF becomes the de facto central bank of the world. Not elected, not accountable, just permanent. That's the engineered collapse. That's the parasitic finance model. And that is the future they are building while we argue about inflation as if it is a weather event instead of a policy choice. So where does that leave us? Right here, 2025. Inflation is still elevated. Debt levels are at record highs. Central banks are trapped between crashing the economy or letting inflation spiral, and the IMF is quietly positioning the SDR as the solution to a crisis they helped create. The stakes are existential, because if the SDR becomes the global reserve currency, it won't matter who you vote for. Your country's economic policy will be written by a board of technocrats you can't fire, operating under rules you didn't agree to, in service of a system that treats sovereignty as a luxury and debt as a birthright. This isn't about left or right. This isn't about capitalism or socialism. This is about power, and the next decade will determine whether that power stays distributed among nations and people, or whether it consolidates into a global financial architecture designed for control. The lesson here is simple. Denial is not a strategy. Trusting institutions that were built to serve empires, not citizens, is not wisdom. And waiting for someone else to fix a system that is working exactly as intended is not a plan. The IMF files didn't expose a conspiracy theory. They exposed the blueprint, and the blueprint says the next meltdown isn't a possibility. It's a necessity, because the system doesn't work without periodic collapse. The collapse is how they reset the board. The collapse is how they buy assets. The collapse is how they issue new SDRs and expand their control. So here's my final question for you. Are we wiser now? Or are we just walking the same path in better suits, with faster technology and more sophisticated lies? If this video made you rethink what you thought you knew about the global economy, share it. Send it to someone who still thinks the IMF is here to help. Drop a comment with your country and tell me if your government is already trapped in this system. And if you want to keep following the money and the files they don't want us to read, subscribe right now. Because the next crisis isn't coming. It's already here. The question is whether we see it in time.